Well, today on the Spiritual Reality Podcast, I want to get into this topic of how do we know that we can trust the Bible. It's kind of an important topic, right? Because as Christians, we base everything we believe on the Bible, and frankly, we should. There are some people who are trying to tell us that we shouldn't. But there are lots of people making reels out there that are saying things like, well, it was written by people, so you can't trust it, or over time, legend developed and people have added to the story, and so a lot of it is made up, and so we can't really know what's true and what's not. And some of those arguments sound pretty reasonable in a 1-minute video, right? They don't need any evidence to spout that, to push that argument out there and to make those accusations, but we have to come up with evidence to refute them. And so as always, listen, if you appreciate the content, make sure that you make sure that you subscribe, especially on YouTube, and share it with a friend. So can we trust the Bible? Let's get to it. In a culture that has huge trust issues. A very common hashtag online is why I have trust issues, or hashtag trust issues. Everything is a conspiracy theory. Everyone's questioning what's behind everything. We now have AI videos that look so real. So now we got to question everything. Is that actually happen or not? So naturally, there are a lot of people casting doubt on the Bible. And keep in mind, in the Marxist worldview, and listen, this is just something that if you don't understand that particular worldview, and we talked about it some on the podcast, you're really missing what is going on in culture. And in the Marxist worldview, anything that is telling you that you should submit to it is oppressive. So it's not an accident that the more that Marxism and critical theory have spread in our culture, the more people want to have reasons that they can absolve themselves from having to submit to the Bible. So that's why you've got such a big push for it now. When you see a lot of these deconstructionists talking online about why we can't trust the Bible, one thing that seems to be very common is they never seem to have found anyone who would answer their questions, at least when they were kind of in the middle of their search. Maybe they were going to a church at the time. They turned to somebody and said, hey, I'm starting to wonder about this. And they were told things like, it's wrong to question the Bible, or you just have to believe. And I think it's so important that we understand, and that's kind of what this podcast is all about, is God never asked us to turn our brains off in order to follow Him. People act like that faith is just hoping in something that we can't possibly know if it's true. But the faith part is not about the facts of Christianity. And I think that's what is so important to understand. The faith part is not about the facts. The faith part comes when, because of the facts, you hand your life over to Jesus. That takes a lot of faith because we like to retain control. We don't know what will happen if we hand our lives over to somebody else and let them be in control. That it's a step of faith. So what I like to kind of compare it to is, I think a lot of people see it as taking a flying leap off of a cliff and hoping Jesus will catch you. And lots of people have taken flying leaps off cliffs, and Jesus has never caught them, right? They've just gone splat. But still, hey, you got to believe. That's not what Christianity is. Christianity is more like boarding an airplane, right? If you remember the first time you got on an airplane, you looked at the thing, you think, this is huge. It weighs, who knows how much? I don't even know how many tons that thing weighs, made out of metal. Like this thing's never going to get off the ground. But what we know factually is we know that planes fly, right? We know that the engines are strong enough to get them off the ground. We know that the wings are designed with the right kind of drag so that when the engines are pushing them, they go up and they stay up. We know that lots of engineering has gone into it. We know that statistically, it's safer than traveling in an automobile. You have a less chance of dying when you get on an airplane than you do getting it in a car. We know that the pilot knows how to get you there. We know that he's been through tons and tons of training. So the problem is not the facts, right? The problem is, am I really willing to commit my life to get up in this airplane? And so again, if you remember the very first time you ever got on an airplane, you remember that feeling, right? Like, wow, like I'm committing my life to this thing that's going to throw me 30,000 feet up in the air and hope that we come down softly, right? But the facts all line up. And so that's much more what it's like, is that you're committing your life to something that you have tons of facts for. And so it's very, very important that we understand that. Jesus said that one of the ways that we are to love God is with all of our minds. Jesus didn't ask us to check our brains at the door and just have pie in the sky faith. Now, some people will say things like, well, there's no archaeological proof for certain things in the Bible. And one of the things you'll notice when people are nitpicking the Bible is they hold the Bible to a standard they don't hold anything else to. So they'll say things like, one of the common things that happened for years was they would say, well, David is so prominent in the Bible, and yet we have no archaeological proof of David. Therefore, that just shows you that all this stuff is made up. So the whole Bible is just made up now because we don't have any archaeological proof of this one guy, at least at that moment. And so I think it's really interesting to hold that standard. If you think about our history on the Revolutionary War, 250 years ago, right? So like just 250 years ago, we're not talking about ancient history. And we begin to hold that same standard. Well, we think we know what happened at this battle, and we think we know what happened but we don't have any muskets from that battle. Actually, we don't have any cannons left from that battle. And so therefore, I don't think the Revolutionary War happened, right? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense when you take that kind of approach. However, what's interesting is the more that we dig, the more that we find the proof that the Bible's true. A renowned Jewish archaeologist and scholar, Nelson Glueck, said, as a matter of fact, it may be categorically stated that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. I mean, just think about that. So we've never dug something up and said, well, the Bible says it this way, and we just found proof from people that lived in that day that that's not what happened. That's crazy. So common thing, again, was David. David, so prominent in the Old Testament, but where's the proof? We have no proof of him. How could there be this Davidic dynasty of succession of kings, and Israel was in its glory days, being so successful in that time, and we don't have any proof for it? Well, until we found the Tel Dan inscription, which mentions the house of David, which kind of indicates a Davidic dynasty in Israel, right? The house of David, like that has ruled for a while. And so it's just interesting, again, that a lot of times they try to apply a standard to the Bible they don't apply to anything else. And we're going to see that in just a moment as well. This is not a new issue. There's a reason the enemy is so bent on questioning God's word, right? It's been his tactic since the 3rd chapter of Genesis when Satan asked Eve, did God really say? If the enemy can get us to question God's words, it opens us up to the opportunity for us to decide how we think things should work. And that's a huge problem. And really, that's where we're trying to head in our culture right now, right? That let's question the Bible so that we can get rid of it. So now we're free to write the rules ourselves. So as believers, being equipped to question and answer this question for ourselves and for others when they are sincerely questioning. And I say sincerely questioning because honestly, your job is not to argue people into the kingdom of heaven. You can't argue, people who don't want to believe that the Bible is true. You hear them say, "Hey, I don't think the Bible's even true." It's much better to ask them good questions. What do you base that on? What research have you done? Have you looked at any of the evidence that says that it is true? Asking questions like that. And if they don't seem to want to know that there's evidence out there that's not true, that it is true, you're wasting your time. But when you have somebody who sincerely is questioning and seeking God, but this is an issue for them, they're like, I just kind of need to understand this. Then this is a great thing to be able to know how to answer them on. And so the Bible claims a couple of things about itself, and that's important. Of course, there's a ton in Psalm 119 about what Psalm 119 is saying about the Bible. But then you've got 2 Timothy 3, and you've got 2 Peter 1, saying that God inspired the Bible. Paul says in 2 Timothy 3 that it is God-breathed. Peter says that the writers did not decide on their own what they wanted to say. But at the same time, you can see their personalities coming out in their writings. So a lot of people look at that and go, well, clearly Luke writes totally different than Paul does, and Paul writes different than Peter does. So these guys are just writing down what they wanted to write down. But I like to think of it as a master musician picking up different wind instruments, right? And so he is blowing the notes and playing the exact notes, blowing through and playing the exact notes he wants on a sax or on a tuba or on a trumpet or on a clarinet. And so in the end, he plays exactly the sounds that he wants. He plays exactly the notes that he wants, but every instrument has a different tone and a different sound. And so I think of it that way, that God still accomplished exactly what he wanted to accomplish. But at the same time, yes, these guys' personality was very much involved in it. So what is the Bible? That's what the Bible claims about itself, but what's the evidence of it? The evidence that it is true. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is internal consistency. I think people who claim that the Bible is just made up don't realize how it came together. Because the way that it came together is such a miracle. It's not like 10 people got into a room and decided to make up a story, and then each of them kind of wrote some books tons of collaboration has gone into the Star Wars series, right? From even those first three, the trilogy, and then writing prequels and sequels, and back and forth like that. Like, a lot of people in the same generation have worked together to make sure that story is consistent and goes well together. But see, the Bible is not one book, and just as those are not one movie, but most of these people didn't get a chance to collaborate. It's a collection of 66 books. It's written by 40 authors over a 1,500-year period on 3 continents and 3 different languages. And yet it has one clear storyline from the first sacrifice at the beginning of the book of Genesis to the end of the book of Revelation. It's all about the Lamb of God. It's all about Jesus. One clear storyline. Everything in the Old Testament points to Jesus. The Old Testament law points to Jesus. The layout of the tabernacle and the temple points to Jesus. The sacrificial system points to Jesus. The mercy seat points to Jesus. The search for the perfect priest and king and prophet in the Old Testament all points to Jesus. So I want you to think about this. If I ask 40 people who live in the same area, speak the same language, and even know each other, to go into separate rooms and write a story about something that they all saw and experienced, you would have a hard time getting the same agreement that you get in the Bible. Now just think about that. You'd have a hard time with 40 people in a room, in separate rooms, that live in the same culture, speak the same language in the same era, and saw the same event. You would have a hard time getting as much agreement on their stories as you got over 1,500 years, 40 different authors, 3 different continents, 3 different languages. That's unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable. The second thing is just manuscript reliability. Now, this is where, it gets a little geeky, but if you care about this issue, it's an important aspect. And so I think it's important to understand that, like any historical document, we don't have the original, what we call autographs, the actual things that Paul wrote. I'm writing to the church in Ephesus, put a stamp on it, send it off, right? Like, we don't have that, but we have copies of it. And so when it comes to archaeological proof for any ancient document, the thing that we look for is how many documents do we have? How many manuscripts, copies do we have? And how close back to the original writings can we get for those? And so that's the standard. Again, they try to apply a standard to the Bible that they don't apply to anything else. So if you've got, let's just say you've got a 100-year gap between when a document was written in the New Testament and when we have our first copy of it, they would say, oh, legend. Lots of legend has entered into that. And so we can't count that. It's not accurate. But what you find is for any ancient document, that actually would be a very, very good record. And so it's interesting when you look at how ancient documents are judged, how the Bible does. And so again, very, very important to understand the manuscripts or copies, and the autographs are the originals, right? So we don't have those. And so the thing is the more manuscripts you have, the more you have to compare to. Right? So if I have 100 manuscripts and, out of that one spells a word differently, I can pretty much assume, especially if maybe some of the other ones are older, some of the ones that didn't have the misspelling, some of those are older, I can assume that this guy along the line, he messed up in copying, because they're hand copying this stuff, right? And so I can assume, all right, the other 99 are correct, and especially because they're older than this one. So, very easy to decide those kind of things. And so the more you have, the better. So I'm going to put this chart up right now and just kind of let you look at this. But look at this comparison between other historical documents and the Bible. And so let's start down at Caesar's Gallic Wars, which I always say is kind of like a campaign commercial, because Caesar wanted these written about him so that he could send them back to Rome and he could gain popularity and power. So imagine if our history books were written off of campaign commercials. Just think about that. So how accurate would that be? But they were written between 44 and 10 BC. The earliest manuscripts we have is 1000 AD. So roughly 1,000 years. 1,010 to 1,044 years is the gap between the first manuscript we have and the time they were first written. And we only have 251 of those manuscripts. And yet we base a lot of our history from Caesar at that time off of what was written there. Demosthenes, his speeches, actually, written 300 BC. The first one we have is in 1100 AD. There's a 1400-year gap, and we have 340 copies. So huge gap, 340 copies. Aristotle's writings, he wrote from 384 to 322 BC. The earliest we have is 850 AD, 1200-year gap, 1,000 copies. That's actually pretty impressive. But you still got a 1,200-year gap. Then Homer's Iliad, which of course is not history, but the question is do we have reliably what he wrote? Okay, so 800 BC. The earliest we have is 400 BC, only a 400-year gap, and we have 1,700 copies plus. So I think, we have pretty good idea of what he actually wrote. Now, New Testament writings, written from 49 to 95 AD. Earliest manuscripts, 117 AD. The time elapsed between 30 and 150 years. 25,000 copies. Now, 5,000 something in terms of Greek copies, and then the rest of those are all in different languages. But just think about that. Just think about that. Even if you just want to go with the 5,000 number and say, well, all the other languages and all the other people copied it, which you also have to ask yourself, why was it so important that 25,000 people copied? And of course, we don't have all of them. We don't have all the ones that people copied. We have 25,000. So how many times was this thing copied in the first, second, third centuries? Like unbelievable. Why was it so important that everybody copy this thing? And again, from 30 to 150 years elapsed, so not very much time. So these people felt like that within a close proximity to the actual events, that this was important enough to copy over and over and over again. So again, the Bible blows any other ancient document away when it comes to the reliability of the text that we have. Now, there are a lot of variants, a ton of variants. When you think about having 25,000, and that's part of the thing, is people will say, I don't know, 200,000 variants. I forget what the number is right off the top of my head. And they'll say, oh, that's just a horrendous, that is just such a, an embarrassing stat for the Bible, right? But when you think about it, no other document can have that many variants between their manuscripts, because they don't have 25,000 manuscripts, right? When people have copied things 25,000 times, handwritten, plus again, all the ones we don't have, we have copies that are copied off of things that we no longer have, right? So part of that 25,000 is a copy off a copy off a copy off a copy off a copy that we don't have, but we have this copy. So when you think about that, we have 25,000 copies, and you think about that, even 200,000, you think about that. For the most part, if you're in one verse, there might be a little bit of controversy over one word, but again, the way you solve those things is what was earliest. So what did the earlier documents say? Because obviously the more you copy, the more you could have mistakes. And what do most of the copies say? And so using that grid, to be honest with you, 70% of the variants are just spelling mistakes. And when you use that grid that I just talked about, literally you get down to 99.5% of every word in the Bible is super clear about what it was intended to be. So 99.5% of every word in our Bibles are just absolutely crystal clear. This is the word that it was meant to be, and this is how it's supposed to be spelled. And the rest of that little minute little bit just has absolutely zero effect on any doctrine of our faith. So that's absolutely stunning when you think about the preservation that God has done and the accuracy that God has preserved for us through the years. Now, again, you're holding a miracle in your hand, but what we've talked about so far is how accurate is our Bible, right? But if it's accurate for a story that's not true, then that's a problem, right? If the story is saying Jesus Christ is the Son of God who came to earth to give his life for us and died and rose again, and that story's not true, but they said it was true, and then we accurately conveyed it and copied it, then that's still a problem. So let's talk about the accuracy of the content. First of all, fulfilled prophecy. Can you trust the Bible? Well, your Bible perfectly nailed over 300 prophecies of the coming Messiah. Written hundreds of years before Jesus showed up on the scene, Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies. And a lot of those prophecies, I'm going to give you 11 right here. A lot of those prophecies were things that he had no control over if he's not God, right? So like the first one, where Jesus will be born. Predicted in the Old Testament, Jesus born exactly where they said he would be born. If you're not God, you have no control over that, where you're going to be born, right? That he would be born of a virgin. Again, no control over that. That he would be from David's lineage. Again, no control over that. That many children would die when he's born because of what Herod ended up doing. Again, he has no control over that. That he would be betrayed at the end of his life for 30 pieces of silver. Again, he has no control over that if he's not God. That people would cast lots for his garment while he's being executed. Again, no control over that. That no bone would be broken during his crucifixion. It was so typical that they would break the legs of the person that they were crucifying so they could no longer push up and they could no longer get a breath, and then they would die more quickly. When they came to him to break his legs, he was already dead. No bone was broken. The idea that he would be crucified. Read Psalm 22 sometime. It perfectly describes a crucifixion. They weren't using crucifixions at that time. That he would come in riding on a donkey. Well, he could have looked in the Old Testament. That's one I'll give you. He could have looked in the Old Testament and said, now I need to find a donkey if I'm going to look messianic. Okay? That he would have to flee as a toddler to Egypt. He had no control over that. That he would be preceded by a messenger like Elijah that turned out to be John the Baptist. I could go on and on and on and on, but those are crystal clear prophecies, most of which, all but except maybe one that I talked about, depended on other people to do them. The chances that one person could have fulfilled one or fulfilled 8 of those, I gave you 11, but the chances that a person could have fulfilled 8 of those hundreds of years after these things were told is 1 in 100 quadrillion. So the national debt is not even to quadrillions yet, thankfully. Will be like next year, but just kidding. And so the chances that one person could have fulfilled 48 of those prophecies is 1 in 10 with 157 zeros after it. We don't even have a word for that. We just have to say 157 zeros, okay? And the chances that someone could fulfill over 300 is 1 in 10 with 2,000 zeros after it. It's been said statistically that you could cover the state of Texas 2 feet deep in silver dollars, and you could just randomly, as you're dumping them out and just piling up the state of Texas in silver dollars, you could mark 1, and you have no idea where it ended up. And you could blindfold a person, spin them around, shove them into the state of Texas, let them wander around, put their hand down once, and it would be the same chance that in that one attempt to pick up a silver dollar, they would happen to get the one that you marked. That's the same chances. So it's absolutely incredible, the fulfilled prophecies in Scripture. And then you've also got a lot of people complain. They say, well, the Bible says these things, but nobody else is corroborating, which is absolutely not true. Again, archaeology is. But then we also have in the first century, for first century facts, we have historians like Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger that confirm details about Jesus' life. They may not have agreed with those things, right? In many cases, these guys are not Christians, so they're not agreeing with them. They're just stating them. They're just saying, hey, there are people running around that are worshiping Jesus. So that he's being worshiped as God. That's a fact. That early in the first couple centuries, Jesus is being worshiped as God. Obviously, that means he existed. He was baptized by John. They're stating that as a fact. That he was crucified by Pilate. And even some allusions that the reason that he is being worshipped is because that it's being reported that he rose from the dead. So while the Bible itself is an accurate historical record, I get so irritated when people are like, well, yeah, that's the Bible, but what other proof is there? Well, when you look at the Bible, as we've just done, it is an unbelievably strong historical record. So it can't just be dismissed out of hand. But even outside of the Bible, there are outside references that list details about Jesus' life as well. And then the kicker is eyewitness testimony. When it comes to the New Testament, which is the heart of the Christian message, we know that we have reliable first-hand accounts of Jesus' life. How do we know that? We know that the disciples were proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead within the lifetimes of the people that could have refuted it. 1 Corinthians is one of the very first books that was written. Very early on. It was written only about 20 years after the resurrection, and in it, Paul claims that 500 people saw Jesus alive immediately after he rose from the dead. You're writing that. You're writing that in the lifetimes of those witnesses. And so, an illustration that I would use is let's just take I don't know, something that has been okay. The new Freedom Tower that has replaced the World Trade Center, okay? Suppose that people started a religion and they started saying, well, it floated down from heaven and it's from the gods and we should worship it. Well, the problem is a lot of us are alive right now and remember when it was built, right? So we know that that's not true. Same is true if these guys are running around within 20 years of the resurrection and saying he rose from the dead, but he didn't, then it very easily would have been disproven. In fact, you just go get the body. I love in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5, they pull the disciples in and they're concerned because they're doing all this stuff in Jesus' name and it's miraculous. And they thought that they put this thing down when they killed him. And basically what their attitude is we can't disprove these guys. So how do we shut them up? Well, why can't they disprove them? There's a body in a grave if it's not true. Go get it. I mean, literally, they could have just petitioned, and you never see this. They petition Rome that we could roll the stone back and show everybody, there he is. Let's stop this nonsense. Because they couldn't, because he wasn't there. So in the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, this wasn't put down. The reason it wasn't put down is because it was true. And the other thing that is interesting about that 1 Corinthians 15 passage is Paul uses at the very beginning of that chapter, which he didn't know was a chapter. We divided the chapters up. But at the beginning of that, he quotes this creed that Jesus died, was buried, and rose again according to, and so it's interesting. He says, I received that. When did he receive that? Well, right after he got saved. That was within maybe 6 years of the resurrection. So now we're talking about that Paul is saying, I received this creed that he died, was buried, and rose again within just a few years of the resurrection. People were running around saying this. The other thing is, it's interesting, these people gave their lives for it. Now, you can point to all kinds of religious nuts who have given their lives for their particular religion, but they weren't the founders that supposedly made it up, right? And so a lot of people have died for a lot of dumb religions, but they weren't the people who supposedly made it up. And so a lot of people say that people will die for a lie. They won't die for a lie that they know they made up. And so it's interesting. I know Chuck Colson, who started Prison Fellowship, he was a big part of the Watergate scandal back in the 70s. And it was interesting. He was very close in Nixon's inner circle, and he went to prison. And he said, I know that the resurrection is true because 13 of us couldn't keep our mouths shut for 3 weeks. And so here he's like, we knew that what we were saying was a lie and we couldn't keep our mouths shut for 3 weeks. And somehow these guys went to their graves, or at least were tortured in John's case, saying it's absolutely true. I can't say anything else is true. And so there's a lot to think about that. So there was not time for legend to enter into the story, because literally within moments, especially when it comes to ancient history, within moments of Jesus' resurrection, people were proclaiming he has risen from the dead. Nobody else, all the people who didn't want it to be true couldn't disprove it, and the people who were his inner circle, who by the way, didn't want to follow him after he was crucified, but gave their lives for him after he rose again, were willing to go all the way to their graves, telling that story. So I would just tell you, what you hold in your hand when you're holding a Bible is a miracle. God preserved it at a level that could only be called miraculous. Many people died to get this message to you. Your hope and faith are anchored in something that is eternal and will not pass away. And so I hope that this gives you a little bit of confidence in that. I would say a few things for you. First of all, you need to know this stuff and have these conversations with your kids and grandkids. They are being bombarded online with people who are making the claims that we've already talked about. You need to give them solid answers. And in this generation, you cannot just say you have to believe it. Because when they were saying that to us when we were in the 70s and 80s, like most of culture believed the Bible was true. And so you had basically all of culture had your back when you said you just have to believe it. That's not true anymore. I would also say treasure the Bible. Treasure the Bible. Get into it and know it. And know how to get into it, which is also another factor. And then third thing is I would say make sure you know the author, not just the book. In Jesus' time, the people who knew the Old Testament the best missed the author. He walked right by him, and they said that's not it, and they missed him. And so I just want to say the book points to Jesus. Don't miss Jesus. It's not just about being the smartest person who knows all the Bible facts or going to enough Bible studies. That's all good. It's important. But it's important that you focus on the author as you're studying the Bible, because that's the point of it, is to point you to Jesus. So thanks for joining me today. We will see you on the next episode of the Spiritual Reality Podcast. See you then.